at KBR, the Royal Library of Belgium. We're here in the wing where the print room is housed, and which are the remains of the palace of Charles of Lorraine, the Governor General of the Austrian Low Countries who lived here in the 18th century. We're here to discuss the Iconographie of Antoine van Dyck, which is a series of portraits of artists, politicians, important people from the 17th century. Van Dyck was very well known as a portrait painter and wanted to stage his fame even more on the international scene. So the way to do it was to make prints. And he brought a few of his prints, especially at the beginning, of colleagues, painters, and also of himself. He did it by means of etching, the etching technique, which was from time to time used by artists because it was relatively easily to draw into the copper. And here we see Van Dyck's self-portrait. You only see the head. It was the only part he actually worked out because he was really experimenting with the technique. He was one of the first artists who started experimenting himself with etching, and he does this self-portrait probably based on a painted portrait where he looks over the shoulder, and we see that he etches in a completely different way as professional printmakers in his age would have done. He did it with a lot of small dots and fine lines, which makes that print can't be printed for numerous times because then already the dots and the fine lines start to wear. So Van Dyck started this etching experiment probably in the late 1620s, around 1630. That is well before Rembrandt took up etching and started experimented with it. But it was Van Dyck's aim not so much to experiment with etching, but to have his iconographie, his series of portraits of famous people and of artists, to have it really published. But then Van Dyck died quite early, quite young, 1641. The series remained unfinished, and it was the publisher who took up the task to complete it and who wanted to have a title page. And therefore designed this kind of pedestal with inscriptions and where Van Dyck's head became a bust portrait. Here we see one of those prints that were never made by Van Dyck, but these portraits that were added to the series, more than 80 in the series finally, were made by other engravers and were based on Van Dyck's portraits. Van Dyck's iconographie often ended up either bound or pasted in albums. It was collected as a kind of who is who in the 17th century, which was probably also Van Dyck's intention. This is an album from the 19th century, and they are in alphabetical order. And then you see the typically published versions, some very good impressions, some rather mediocre impressions. So it was really some kind of collector's items, the separate prints, which you then could put together. And here we see only Van Dyck turning up at the D with the print that was actually intended as the frontispiece by Van Dyck's publisher. Here we see the portrait of Lucas Forsterman, who was the engraver that helped out Van Dyck in finishing his iconography, and most probably also learned Van Dyck to etch. This is one of the 15 or so portraits that Van Dyck etched entirely or partly himself. And this is also a very early proof state where you can see how Van Dyck is really experimenting with the medium. And you also see that he had problems with the etching ground, and that there were bubbles in it, that you have full biting and other problems which you typically see with a beginner or an amateur printmaking. Details that also make those prints very charming in another way. And here you see in Forsterman's portrait also that Van Dyck is really peeping into someone's mind. You see a man with somewhat anxious, tormented gaze. It's not the kind of portrait you expect in the Baroque era, where everything is very formal and everything is very neat and clean, and you really see a man of flesh and blood. What Van Dyck especially wanted to show with his iconography, I think, was his virtuosity as a portrait painter. And it certainly helped to give the portrait painting a boost of appreciation in Europe and in the world of those days, because portraiture was seen as a lesser genre, and Van Dyck brought some credibility to the genre as a higher form of art. And I think the iconography has contributed to that evolution in a very large way, and continue to do so until in the 18th, early 19th century, because Van Dyck had a lasting influence on portraiture in Europe.